is Rohan Brill. Rohan is an agronomist and farmer based at Ganmain. Is that how we say it?
Ganmain, yeah.
Ganmain in New South Wales with Brill Ag. Took him a long time to come up with the company name. He coordinates canola research for this GRDC hyper-yielding crops project, as well as leading the New South Wales Pulse Agronomy project, which has a focus on understanding nitrogen balance of pulse crops in southern New South Wales. Rohan.
Thank you. Righto. So yeah, Ganmain is northwest of Wagga, about 60 k's northwest of Wagga. And yeah, so I really get into these sort of things. Initially, I was employed by New South Wales DPI, but now probably the thing that keeps me awake at night is our farm that we live and work on, my wife and family. And it's great to be able to, a lot of the work I want to do is actually really try and answer questions that I'm having issues with on my own farm. So that's one of the reasons why I get involved in research and a lot of things that I do. So hyper-yielding canola is a high rainfall zone project, but I farm in a medium rainfall environment. But there's a lot of learnings from any environment where we get research from, and we can learn a lot from hyper yield. Even if we're obviously in an irrigation environment, you need to adopt the findings for your own system, but there's still a lot to learn from research in other environments. Damien did touch a little bit on canola yield potential. So absolute yield potential is driven not by water, not by fertility, but by energy and temperature. So the ratio of the amount of energy coming from the sun to the mean temperature is the thing that drives the potential of your crop. So that assumes that you've got enough water, you've got enough nutrition, and basically, so on that pie graph there, the greater proportion of solar exposed, of say energy coming from the sun that you get compared to temperature, the more yield potential you get. So if we look at a few environments, so we've got a calculator that's a little bit different to AppSim, and I've just picked out a few different environments, sort of locally, I suppose, and also where I've done trials, and worked out what the photothermal quotient is. So the photothermal quotient is basically energy in divided by mean temperature, and what I've picked there is a photothermal quotient in the optimum critical period of crops in these environments. And one thing I have done, which probably skews it a little bit wrong, is that I've picked optimum flowering dates for dry land. So Damien did show that you probably flower a little bit later on irrigation. So that might actually push the, because water's not such a big issue, you might actually push flowering date a little bit later on most dry land crops. And generally if you push flowering date later, you get longer days, you get more energy. But the temperature does go up, but you have to adjust for both. So if we look somewhere like Urana I've got there, one big thing you look at there, our optimum flowering dates are so strongly driven by temperature. You see, they're not that different. And we'd sort of say, oh, Kerang's probably warmer than Wallenbean where I do trials, so that's up near Cootamundra. But we don't flower in that much warmer conditions. The reason that the yield potential is lower is because you flower in shorter days and you have less energy. So generally at Kerang, say you're flowering, I think there were some figures there, say starting late July, mid-July or something. In that period there, you're dealing with days that are 10 hours of sunshine or something along those lines. Wallenbean, we're flowering late August into September. So you're pushing up towards, say, 12 hours of sunshine. So you get much more sunlight and energy coming into the crop for the same amount of mean temperature. If you go to an extreme situation, orange, I think it's about 900 metres elevation or something like that. And that's not far from orange, even higher again, was Oberon, where they broke the world record for canola. And I think it was at like 1,100 metres elevation, where the optimum flowering date is probably like October. It's still only 10 or 11 mean daily temperature, but you're probably getting 20 plus megajoules per metre squared of energy coming in per day. So not necessarily... Yeah, so this doesn't take into account frost risk. You can obviously have pretty savage frost risk if you're flowering in a valley at orange, but if you're flowering at orange in October, it's probably much less of a risk. When we calculate that out, you can see obviously the photothermal quotient increases with these sort of softer environments. And I've calculated, based on this calculator we've got, which is not actually sort of AppSim derived, I got to Kerang with a yield potential of 5 tonne of the hectare. That'd probably go up a little bit if I took an irrigated optimum flowering date. Wallenbean, we're pushing, where I've got the hyper yield trials, we're pushing up closer to about 8 tonne of the hectare. Orange, say in the central tablelands, 9 tonne to the hectare roughly. I would say overall though, you're probably getting, I've seen some of Damien's results, he's probably getting closer with his plots to the yield potential at Kerrang than what we are at a place like Wallenbean, where the highest yield I think I've got sort of in the low to mid sixes, sort of 80% of environmental potential, whereas some of the irrigation ones, you're probably pushing up 90, 100%, and sometimes even you see some numbers that are above potential. So I think it's just important to sort of understand what the background is and how important some of those factors are. So Wallenbean in 2022, we had 15% lower radiation than 2021. We had 5% increased temperature, so double whammy. We reduced energy, increased temperature. Most of that increased temperature, you think it's cold because it's cloudy, but it's actually warm because it's cloudy, because the nights are warm. You don't get anywhere near as much cold temperature. So our yield potential dropped in 2022 from 7.7 tonne to the hectare with the same calculation back to 6.1. That was just based on light and temperature. And pulling that apart a little bit, don't bother too much about the figures at the top, but we were down pods per square metre by 25%, seeds per pod down by 20%. But because we were sort of so low in seed number, the seed size was actually bigger. So sometimes you see bigger seeds because there just weren't enough seeds to actually fill, and they actually had bigger seed size at the end. The biggest trial plot we've ever had was 2021, so biggest predicted mean across the whole trial, 45Y95 in 2021. 21 seeds per pod, 8,500 pods a square metre. Came out about 175,000 seeds per square metre. And we do see this a little bit, that canola varieties that are high yielding tend to have a high number of seeds per pod and a high number of pods per square metre. They might not be the highest overall. You see something like that there. So Wahoo's a TT, a lot of seeds per pod, low number of pods per square metre. Condor, we're probably seeing that a little bit, that low number of seeds per pod, but high number of pods per square metre. And 45Y95 in those trials, fairly high number of both. So you need to be sort of ranked in the top 10 or 20% of both those factors to get high yield, not necessarily the highest. The one that I've seen most consistently that does this is actually Diamond, and consistently it'll be ranked high for seeds per pod and high for pods per square metre, and that's why it often generates a very, very high yield potential. But I guess I suppose it's important then to work out, right, how we grow a high yielding crop. We've done some of the research to work out, well, what's the critical period of the growth? And so you need then to sort of manage your water, manage your nitrogen, manage all your fertility so that you can match the optimum critical period for growing a crop. So what we've actually done here is we've actually stressed the crop. 0 here is what we call a start of flowering. And what we've done is actually put shade over the top of a crop for roughly 10-day periods across the season. So if we put shade over the top of the crop before flowering, this is a canola crop, it didn't actually have any impact on yield. But put shade over the top of the crop for 10-day periods during flowering, so you'll see that period from 0 to say 600 degrees after the start of flowering, so that's a thermal time after the start of flowering, we really dropped yield. So it's that period from the start of flowering till about a month after the start of flowering when you want everything going right for the crop to get maximum yield potential. And why would you use shade? Basically, it's the easiest thing in the whole photosynthesis equation to turn off and on. It's pretty hard to just turn water on, turn water off, and it's hard to turn carbon dioxide on and off. But shade, the energy coming in from the sun, you can actually just really put shade over, stop photosynthesis for, really minimise photosynthesis for about 10 or so days, and then take it off and let it go again. So you've got to sort of think about how to manage the crop. Really, to manage a crop, we try to invert that. So we want, you want as much growth as possible in that post-flowering period. And that's been pretty consistent across the research I've seen. When we correlate biomass and yield from sowing to flowering, there's just no correlation. There's just a shotgun. But you correlate growth from the start of flowering to maturity, and you just get this very straight line correlation with yield and biomass. You do need a base level of biomass to be able to set enough yield potential. You can't go and get a scungy little 2-leaf, a crop that's not even covering the ground to then go and yield 6 tonne to the hectare. Something like stingray is probably the type of crop that we do struggle sometimes to get enough biomass at the start of flowering if it's, under fertilised, but pretty rare in all the trials I've done in hyper yield and that sort of thing that you don't have enough. Yeah, there's not many crops that are limited by vegetative biomass anyway. And some of the factors we've done in the hyper yield project are actually to have a look at how to achieve some of these really high yields. Plant density's been one. It's been probably the most boring. We just haven't had any real response whatsoever. They often look very different initially, so 15 to 75 plants a square metre up the top there. And basically as your season progresses, you'll see they just fill in more and more. And just had very little difference in the whole hyper yield project, except for the fact that we tend to increase lodging with higher plant populations, but not much yield response. So that one's pretty simple, and lodging obviously depends on variety to an extent. Disease management, how many fungicides go out on a crop here on average? Damien, you could probably tell me. Craig, come on, you. 2 foliars, yep. Plus probably a seed treatment, yep. So diamond's probably the extreme end of it, yep. We haven't really found, so if growers are already putting 2 fungicides on diamond, we haven't found any need to do any more than that. And certainly we've just found at least that, so if we go from nil fungicide, this is from Wallenbean for 3 years, a fairly high disease pressure environment, from absolutely nil fungicide, nothing on the seed, no foliar fungicides, to full protection, which was Sultro on the seed, Prosaro at 4-leaf, Aviator at 20% bloom, and another Prosaro at 50% bloom. We've picked up on average probably about half a tonne of yield. So it hasn't been as amazing as we probably thought it would be. And growers are probably already capturing most of that by, most growers would have, say, Sultro or Levo or something on their seed. Most growers, I'd say, would be doing 1 foliar application, I assume, on irrigation environments. So we're not seeing big gains by needing to put more fungicide out. Cereal's probably a different story. If you grew Rockstar wheat at Wallenbean and didn't put fungicide on it, it would yield about 10% of a full protection, where canola is actually fairly robust. We've historically probably thought canola was a risky crop for disease, but it's not falling apart. Partly I think due to plant breeding, partly that the earlier you sow canola, the less blackleg risk you'll have, because you just get it into a warmer, quicker environment and gets away from blackleg. So that's fairly important too. Nutrition's probably been one of our most interesting things, and part of it has been that we haven't had quite as strong a response to nutrition as we probably expected. Although this is just from 2022, where we did have a fairly strong response at Nawari. So what I've got there in the dark bars is where no nitrogen was applied. The yellow bar is where basically pretty much 500 kilos of urea was applied. And then the red bar is where we had that 500 kilos of urea and then put 3 tonne of the hectare of animal manure over the top, so 3 tonne dry matter basis. And the green bar was where we looked at the analysis of the animal manure and put the inorganic equivalent in as fertiliser. So basically you see Nawari was really waterlogged and we had a strong response to nitrogen. So we increased by about 2 tonne of the hectare from going from nil N to 225 kilos of N. Pretty much at all those sites, we still increased yield from 225 kilos of N applied where we put animal manure over the top. And most of those had about 40 kilos of P at sowing. They had 20 kilos at least of sulphur. So we probably thought we had nearly everything satisfied, but we still actually had a yield boost from that manure. But on at least a couple of sites, we had a greater benefit again, where we actually just put the manure nutrition out just as basically MAP and urea and that sort of thing. So haven't quite teased apart yet exactly what the response to manure is, whether it's something whether it's something to do with the spatial availability of it, or if it's just something else it's delivering like potassium or trace elements in it. But we've had this really strong response to it. And that 2 tonne response to that nitrogen inputs has been probably atypical of the trials we've done. We've more often plateaued yield, probably on average around that 75 to 100 kilos of nitrogen. And this is with yields at sort of 4 or 5 tonne of the hectare of canola too. And often that is because we're probably selecting sites that are where we want to maximise yield potential rather than where we want to get a nitrogen response. And so I know the Wallenbean site, it's 3% organic carbon quite often. It's coming, it's not far off a pasture phase. So if you do some rough rules of thumb, Wallenbean's probably 400 mils growing season rainfall, and just the rule I use for mineralisation is 0.15 times growing season rainfall times organic carbon, which is a very loose rule of thumb probably. But yeah, we're getting mineralisation potential of well over 200 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, plus the stored nitrogen in the soil as well. It's supplying 300 or 400 kilos of nitrogen from the soil. And that's what's driving the high yield potential rather than the fertiliser, urea inputs. But we do want to tease apart a little bit more that manure effect. This is one big thing that's probably different for irrigation, is that the varieties are probably going to be slightly different than what works in a higher rainfall environment. So the standout have been the Clearfields, so 45Y95 especially in 2022 was a standout, and again in 2021. But that might not necessarily be the case in irrigation, where you're dealing with much more risk of lodging and that sort of thing. And often you probably err towards quicker varieties. And from what I've seen in the trials I've done, I did a little bit of irrigation work around Finley, 2014, 15, 16. And Diamond was consistently the standout in that environment. It's been one of the varieties that really pushes yield higher and higher. But 45Y28 is also a great plant type, but there's a few others hopefully coming through. I've put a few in italics there that look interesting. It's funny, new seed Emu is sort of roughly a true flex equivalent of Diamond. If you look at NVT, you'd think, oh, why would I grow that? Because it doesn't look that good. But it really has that same sort of plant types, and sometimes you just have to deep dive in NVT and work out varieties that are outliers in their phenology in NVT often don't. It's hard to manage those varieties optimally because you have you manage them for the middle variety in the trial, and the varieties that are really slow or really fast might sort of suffer a little bit because of that. So I think there's obviously not a lot to pick from in the Clearfield. There's a fair few coming out in TTs, so I probably generally find that TTs are a little bit weaker in the stem though, so that's one thing to keep in mind. And 45Y28 too, it's been around for a little while, but still a really good plant type for irrigation scenarios. But how do we drive these, I suppose, hyper-yielding farming systems? And is it about fertiliser or fertility? Really, it's about both. We sort of have to have fertiliser. Fertiliser feeds the crop, but it also maintains soil fertility. So another aspect I've been working in is pulse agronomy. Really, so on our own farm, we've really tried to increase our grain legume because I just don't think we were growing as good a crops as what we should have been. We weren't yet. Our water efficiency of our canola and cereals just wasn't actually fully topping out, and so we needed to get more pulses into the system. So one thing we've tried to do then is really understand the nitrogen contribution of the crop. So we go in there, we measure the biomass of the crop. So I guess I'm segueing into this because I think it's so important to drive the yield potential of canola especially. So we go in there into these pulse crops and we can measure the biomass of the crop. So what we call peak biomass is around 30 to 50% potting stage. And you look at something like fava beans and chickpeas, obviously quite different in what they look like and what their biomass is above ground. To do this, to go and work out the nitrogen derived from the atmosphere, so this is one critical component of it, and something it's really not that well understood. We need to have a reference plant. We have a non-legume plant. So what's important is that the nitrogen in the atmosphere is a little bit different to the nitrogen in the soil. So we have a 14N isotope and a 15N isotope. And generally in the soil, that 15N isotope is a bit more abundant than the 14N isotope in the atmosphere. So if your fava bean crop doesn't fix any nitrogen, it should sort of look like a canola plant growing in the same environment because it's only pulling nitrogen from the soil. But if a fava bean plant looks, the nitrogen signature in the fava bean looks exactly like the atmosphere, then the nitrogen in that fava bean plant is purely fixed nitrogen. So then we can actually use some calculations. And these samples, I don't do this at my little lab at Ganmain. This gets sent to UC Davis in California, and these samples get properly analysed to actually work it out. And if we step through something, this is just a site there in central New South Wales. We had 9.6 tonne of biomass of chickpeas, nearly 17 of faba beans. Percentage nitrogen in chickpeas was 1.6%, 2.5% for beans. They were on very hungry paddock, and roughly 90% of that nitrogen was derived from the atmosphere, which means that if we looked at the shoot nitrogen fix was about 140 kilos for chickpeas, 373 for beans. But there's nitrogen underground as well. So for beans at least, about 50% as much again as what we see on top. So we've actually come out then, we've got about 560 kilos of nitrogen fixed by that bean crop. So when we take that underground component, it really does get quite significant. So faba beans yielded 5.7 in that situation, chickpeas 2.1, grain nitrogen removed 4.4% for beans, 3.4% for chickpeas. So about a 300 kilo legacy for beans and a 200 kilo legacy for chickpeas. So one thing with chickpeas is that the rule of thumb is that they have a higher nitrogen proportion below ground compared to beans and field peas and that sort of thing. And overall, we've just found that obviously biomass is king. Increasing biomass equals more nitrogen fixed. And on average, we've got to about 33 kilos of nitrogen fixed per tonne of biomass at that peak biomass stage. So it's a bit higher than a lot of rules of thumb, because that's included the nitrogen that's in the below ground root components. So I think it really, you can see how much value is in pulse crops, I suppose. If you can grow a 15 tonne biomass, you're looking at around sort of 500 kilos of nitrogen fixed. And then when we look at the end balance, once grain's taken out, obviously the more biomass we grew, we still had a higher end balance, but not quite as tight a relationship. But we're going up some of these 17 tonne of the hectare faba bean biomass crops doing 300 kilos plus nitrogen balance after harvest. And really, what does it mean at the end of the day? This is just a situation there. One of my grower clients, it was all cereal in 2020. He put a paddock of lupins in the middle in 2021 and put canola over the lot in 2022. Got a fair bit of waterlogging, 100 kilos of N over the whole lot. It was 3 tonne of the hectare versus 1.7 over the rest of it. So, sometimes we say pulses don't pay, but yeah, they really do when you sort of factor things in over a long term for a number of factors, I believe anyway. So, that's probably just really the take home there. And I think don't underestimate those contributions from pulses into the soil. Thank you. Right there.
Thanks, Rowan. So, as you know, this is the time where we ask questions. Amy is wandering around. I can't see Belinda. Oh, there she is, over there. Who's got a question for Rowan? You've either floored them or put them to sleep. Oh, there's one. Down. Oh, two. No. Oh, the troublesome corner. Sorry, we should leave a microphone there.
Rowan, with the hyper-yielding work, is it fair to say that variety choice was the number one thing in the sort of ranking of factors that changed yield?
Nutrition and variety choice, yeah, between the two of them. But you can have such a... Variety choice is probably the cheapest thing to get right. Nutrition costs money quite often. But yeah, if you grow a bad variety and it's cost you $80 a hectare, and another variety grows a tonne of the hectare more, and it still costs you $80 a hectare, it doesn't cost you any more to grow a good variety. And I guess that's why information on varieties is really important, but it's probably something that, Damien's probably, the local data on varieties is probably more important than I can sort of generate from hyper yield to adopt for this environment. But variety choice is money for jam, I think, in canola especially.
Rowan, is it possible that manure effect is a closer matching of supply and demand with a slow trickle of nutrients over the growth of the crop, and on those longer season ones with the moisture that can do that, that might work, but on a drier environment, put it out there, it might do nothing?
I reckon it could be, but I don't think it's a nitrogen effect because, so the Wallenbean site in 2021, we had a half a tonne yield kick from manure. It was 3% organic carbon. We had 500 kilos urea applied, and that kick came over and above that level. But possibly the IREC work I've seen, I can't remember the guys who did it, but there was an article recently published, and they sort of believe it was because of phosphorus release matching better with critical timing. So I don't exactly know, but they reckon it was because you actually had phosphorus available to the crop when it needed through that crop critical period. That was their case. Anyway, there's an article on that by the IREC guys done at Griffith using it.
I was just going to speculate on that point, Rohan, because the critical phosphorus requirement over a whole range of soils is about 28 to 36, but there was some work done down at Hamilton that showed for hyper-yielding crops it might be 70.
Might be higher, yeah.
All right. So what you've done is effectively doubled your phosphorus rate, or maybe even more with the manure. And sometimes what happens with phosphorus demand from crops is that the soil can't supply the P quick enough.
Yep.
So it's bound tightly and comes off slowly into solution. And if you've got a hyper-yielding crop with peak demand, sometimes that supply is not quick enough to meet crop demand. But so I'm speculating, but there is some evidence supporting your comment.
Yeah, and I think that's the finding by the IREC guys. I just can't think of the authors' names, but there's an article from IREC, the Griffith Irrigation, because Griffith is home to manure. So it's not because it's shit, but so it is not a bad town actually, but that's sort of their theory as to why the response came about.
There's one up in the back row there, please, Amy. I'm going to take that away. Griffith is... I want to see a bumper sticker. Griffith, the home of manure. I reckon there's a market for those stickers.
G'day, Rohan. Tim Watson from Rochi. Just question is, with the favour bean stubbles, when should that nitrogen become available? And I ask because I've just had some deep ends done, and my nitrogen levels are abysmal after the beans.
That's a good question. It's not something that I'm definitely not an expert in this field. I'm just sort of observing what we've found. And we've done soil tests after these, and we're showing in soil tests a boost of 20 or 30 kilos of N, even though we've sort of shown differences of 200 kilos of nitrogen. So I don't know the exact answer to that, but I think it's going to come online as you get moisture and that sort of thing in spring, and you get mineralisation of those, which I think is a good thing. I think in farming systems I'd rather, just a constant stream of mineral N with this big bank of organic N that's releasing it. We don't really. What's probably worse to have is a big bank of mineral N, and then no release from the organic pool. So I think it's a good thing that they don't necessarily register. But what I think is really lacking is a good prediction, and knowing if you could put into a model, like just a simple model to say, righto, well, I just did a deep end test. The favour bean paddock says I've got 80 kilos. The canola stubble says I've got 60. One's got a lot more. You don't need to fertilise that favour bean paddock quite as much, but you don't have a really objective number to predict that, I don't think. And I think that's something that could be really, more fine-tuned in a lot of our... It would add a lot of value to deep ends. Deep ends are a good tool, but they are a snapshot. They don't sort of obviously give you any prediction of the future.
Okay, we won't make the last question answer, or speculation indeed, from this corner before we go into the next session.
And Rohan, just to support your comment there, first of all, deep ends, if they're done pre-sowing, are really highly variable, and that occurs because in relation to when rainfall occurred and temperature. And so if you do them after sowing, but before you've got to make a decision into row, it actually reduces the variability. Yeah. But the interesting thing about favour beans is that when you compare them to, say, field peas, favour beans release a higher proportion in the second year compared to field peas. Now, just to be clear, most of the N is available in the first year, but compared to field peas, they carry over a higher proportion into the second year. And there's some good published work on that. And so I would expect that the favour beans are probably going to deliver most of their N in the spring and not in the autumn.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, we